This coming week, we're going to spend the entire class period either using ink or watercolor for the model. So I would like you to listen to these couple of chapters from Nicolaides, The Natural Way to Draw, and decide if you're going to use ink or watercolor for your drawings. Okay, the first one is section 5, the modeled drawing in ink, the daily composition. Also, the materials that you have might you might not have a choice. Maybe you only have watercolor and that's what you're going to use. Okay, the limitations of preconceived ideas. In learning to draw, it's necessary to start back of the limitations that casual information sets upon you. Preconceived ideas about things with which you have no real experience have a tendency to defeat the acquiring of real knowledge. One handicap that people have in looking at a painting is that they relate to it, not to an actuality, but to other pictures of what they have accidental knowledge. Watch a child draw a house. He has in mind no picture that he has ever seen, no system for representing shingles or bricks, unless he has been spoiled by the wrong kind of instruction. In his mind is an actual house, which he feels is actually building as he draws. I watched one of my sons draw a dragon when he was about 4 years old. He contorted his own face and muscles as he drew, and seemed actually to be afraid of the thing when he saw it on the paper. We think too often of the thing we draw in terms of the ways we have seen it drawn. Think of the figure not as if painted by Titian or Renoir, but as actual flesh and bones. If you make drawings of a knee until you are 100 years old, your conception of it will still be far from what a knee actually is. Many painters learn to paint a knee in a certain way during their first year in art school, and some go on painting the same knee for the rest of their lives. Do not allow familiar labels to interfere with fresh impulses. Disregard ideas that are already formulated or constantly test them by new, fresh experiences. Realize the actual existence of an arm or a leg in space as contrasted with the idea of an arm or leg. The only way around the limitations of our preconceived notions is the physical action of our 5 senses. You must get at a direct contact with the model. There is much talk about beauty and much talk about truth, but all the student need concern himself with is reality. That natural reality which he recognizes in normal everyday life and which establishes itself in his mind through his senses. Do not miss the sort of thrust which says that this is sand, this is water, these are trees. Remember, the trees could be cut up and made into some sort of lumber. Water is heavy and wet. It is not just so much color. Do not look at wood's interior as spots of green, but get into it and realize that there are trees between the other trees. So I think what he's really trying to say is that we can't depend on what we think of, like using our memory or, kind of what we think things look like. And we're going to talk about this later, but that's when we're going to talk about this when we talk about proportions. But we can know the rules of proportion, but when it comes down to it, it almost doesn't matter because it depends on the perspective, right? So, and the only way we can really get the perspective is by looking and seeing and sort of feeling and sort of being there, And sometimes we're just there with our eyes, but we're not going to know it unless we really look at it and understand it. Okay, so the model drawing in ink. So if you choose to use ink, you can, you should have your black drawing ink and an ordinary pen or pen points. The point should be large and strong and blunt, preferably with a ball-shaped tip so that it will easily move in any direction. This exercise is exactly like the model drawing in with the oil pastel or the crayon, except that you only have the points of the pen with which to make contact instead of a broad surface of the crayon, and consequently, it becomes necessary to do a great deal of scratching around. Here's the example. I'll continue reading. You can see these examples. Start in the center of the form, just like you did with the crayon, and make in the beginning of the same sort of rotating movement that you made with the crayon, constantly filling in the form and working out towards all the surfaces. Keep the pen moving over the paper in all directions without lifting it. Then, as with the crayon or the oil pastel, make contact with the vertical and horizontal contours, pressing back and forth where the form goes back and lightly where it nears you. Remember that there will be no outline because you do not think of edges. Do not be timorous or hesitant. Press hard, even if the pen tears into the paper and makes huge blots. Work freely and vigorously. Do not hesitate to keep working over the forms until your drawing is completely black. So again, I'll show you this. So this, if you prefer to use ink, you can use that. You could do it in that. You could also try using both. Maybe part of your drawings are with ink and part of them are with watercolor. All right, so I'm going to show you some of the examples that they have. This is Toulouse-Lautrec, Gousse Daumier, this is by Van Dyck, this is by Fine. This is by Millet, Michelangelo. So beautiful. This is by Francisco Goya, Cézanne. This is by Poussin. This is by Gainsborough. Okay, so now I'm also going to read section 6, which is about the model drawing in watercolor. So like I said, if you want to try using both, you're welcome to do that. The right angle study is what they're saying. Variety of medium. Today you will begin the practice of the model drawing in a third medium, watercolor. Each medium that you use should enrich the others. Practice with pen and ink, for example, contributes something to the use of watercolor, which practice with watercolor alone cannot give, making it fuller and more varied as a medium of expression. As far apart as etching and oil painting are, the one contributes to the other, as in the work of Rembrandt. This change of medium might be likened to a change of language. The experience of using two languages makes each more rich than can be possible. The experience of using two languages makes each more rich than it can possibly be by itself. And more important, the attempt to convey a thought from one language to another makes possible a finer comprehension of the thought. We are all prone to accept our preconceptions instead of investigating a thing fully and anew. Once we have had an experience, the repetition of the experience becomes muffled and not clear. We anticipate it, and in anticipating, we lose the significance, the meaningful detail. The very difficulties of using a new medium, like the difficulties of using a new language, tend to bring you back to the meaning you desire to convey, because the medium can be used properly only in relation to your grasp of the meaning. So so here is a student model drawing in watercolor. Oh, these are both student model drawings in watercolor. So you can see that they're using different values to build up the form. Okay, so what he says, the materials, says to use large sheets of cream colored manila paper. I don't know that you have that, so you can use, I would just use like multimedia paper or drawing paper, should be totally fine. He says here, do not use watercolor paper even if you can afford to. The tough manila paper is better for this exercise. I mean, if you only have, I mean, watercolor paper, we're going to be making a lot of sketches, so I don't know. I mean, if you have enough watercolor paper, you can totally use that. And then it says, he says, use 3 tubes of cheap watercolor, yellow, ochre, burnt sienna, and black. If you want to try those 3, you can. But I think you could also use like maybe ultramarine blue and burnt umber or raw umber. Because as you know, you could mix them together and you can get black. And I mean, I would just say you should have maybe 2 colors, maybe 2 colors that are complementary colors. You could even just use 1 color that's dark, use that for the dark areas, and then add some water to make the lighter areas. I'm gonna leave it up to you. You can experiment as you're painting. It's important that you should use, well, they say you should use tube colors. I don't think you necessarily need to use tube colors as long as you spray your watercolors ahead of time. Like spray your watercolors maybe 10 minutes before we start so that it's, if you have the pan, and it will get them nice and juicy, okay? And then you'll need 1 paintbrush and obviously some water. Yeah, and maybe watercolor, so either paper towel or some rags. Okay, this is essentially the same exercise as the model drawing with the crayon. But naturally, whether you press lightly or hard with a brush load of color makes no difference in the lightness or darkness of the color that appears on the paper. Therefore, you will use the dark colors to give the sensation of pressing back that you have gotten previously by actually pressing with the crayon or the pen. Use the lightest color for the first step, the building up of the form from the center to the outside surfaces. For the next step, touching the vertical and horizontal contours, mix burnt sienna and black until you get sort of a chocolate color with which you model the forms before the yellow ochre is too dry. Keep the whole thing going at once. As before, pay no attention to the edges. So depending on what colors you're using, you're gonna get the whole form in with the lighter version of the color, and then you can go back and add the darker shadows. Okay, if a time comes when the paper is so wet that it refuses to take any more color without spreading it meaninglessly, start another study and keep 2 going at once. That makes sense. If it's too wet for you to apply the dark color on top, start another painting of it, and then you can go back when the other one is drying. All right, so keep 2 going at once. Work on one while the other dries a little. Keep the brush fairly dry by wiping it with the rag or the paper towel before dipping it into the color. In the first stage, building up with yellow ochre, the brush will be wetter than in the second stage. Keep the color full and thick. Fill the brush with it, using plenty of pigment. It should not be thin and watery. The use of watercolor in this exercise has nothing to do with watercolor technique or with color. It is simply an exercise in drawing for which we use a color roughly approximating that of flesh instead of black. It will not approximate the color of many things you draw, but that does not matter. You should not think now of trying to reproduce any color that you may see. Work exactly as you did with the crayon and the pen, bringing the form forward when it's nearer to you and pushing it back and making it darker as it goes away from you. With the crayon, you should push the surfaces back from you by pressing harder. Here you must do it by letting the color get darker. That is the only difference.